says, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." And in other places in Revelations it says, "Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying." In other places it says, "Today, if you hear God's voice." And other places it says, "Hear the word of the Lord." So there's this constant encouragement to listen. And it's not more than just, we all have ears, we know that, but it's a deeper kind of listening. It's a listening deep within our hearts, our spirits. So I invite you now just to kind of take a deep breath, breathe in, and breathe out. And I want you, next time you breathe in, to imagine that it's God's Spirit filling this place. Breathe it in, and breathe out. I invite you just to kind of pay attention to your breathing here during this chapel as we listen deeply to God's Spirit and the words of Scripture. Now, my own journey with Scripture has been a bit mixed. Sometimes I have not always appreciated the Bible, simply in part because I've seen the ways in which it's been abused, or used in ways to do harm to others or judge unfairly certain groups of people. And we also have to take Scripture lightly because, frankly, we don't always understand what Scripture means. It was written in a different time, a different place, a different culture. So sometimes we really do have to take it in context. I remember one time when I was getting up to preach, the Scripture reader for that day was sick. And so last minute I grabbed one of the youth in my congregation. I asked them to read Psalm 139, which happens to be one of my favorite scripture passages or chapters in Psalm. It's the one that talks about, where can I flee from God's Spirit? God knows me inside and out and knew me before I was even formed in my mother's womb. But they accidentally read Psalm 137 instead. And if you're familiar with Psalm 137, the last verse says this: "Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock." And I was sitting there just kind of horrified, like, how am I going to preach on this, And really, if you read that psalm in context, it's about the people of Israel who've been taken captive. Their city of Jerusalem has been destroyed. They've been taken captive to Babylon. And it's really a psalm of lament about the violence that they have experienced and the deep grief that they feel. And in many ways, it's a very honest kind of crying out of some of the feelings of hatred and bitterness that they have towards their enemy. And but we have to take that in context, right? And I think as Mennonite Anabaptists, we believe that we read all of Scripture through the lens of Jesus. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we take Jesus' words and kind of use that to interpret all the rest of Scripture. So Jesus, we hear from Jesus saying very clearly to love your enemy and to not repay evil for evil. So we always listen to those words in context of the laments of Psalms. Well, this morning you'll have an opportunity to read your favorite scripture passage, but I invite you also not just to think of those scripture verses that kind of give you warm, fuzzy feelings, but also to think of those scripture passages that really inspire you, challenge you, encourage you to live rightly, to live justly, to relate to others with kindness and mercy and compassion. One of those verses for me comes from Matthew 7. And it goes like this: "Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?" That is such a rich image. And frankly, it's one that oftentimes pops up in my head when I'm about ready to make a judgment of another person. Kind of the image of having a log in my own eye while I'm trying to point out the speck in somebody else's eye. So what scripture is meaningful to you? Maybe over this past month, this past year, what inspires you, what encourages you. There are a few Bibles at the end of the pews if you need something to kind of leaf through. You have an opportunity, we'll have some handheld mics that you don't necessarily have to stand, but you do need to raise your hand so that a mic can be brought to you, or you can come up here to the podium to speak.